Welcome to the 2020 Virtual Decatur Book Festival. I'm George Weinstein, Acting President and Executive Director of the Atlanta Writers Club. The Atlanta Writers Club was founded in 1914 and exists to teach its members the craft and business of writing. We're also sponsors of local literary events, including the Decatur Book Festival, which we've been a proud sponsor of since 2006. You can read all about the Atlanta Writers Club at our website, atlantawritersclub.org. I'm here tonight to introduce you to Faulkner finalist and best-selling novelist Ron Rash. Ron is also the author of numerous books of poetry and short stories. His latest, In the Valley, was published in August and includes short stories that are already being gathered for best of anthologies and a novella that reintroduces readers to Serena Pemberton, his complex heroine from his 2008 bestseller, Serena. Our bookstore sponsor tonight is Tall Tale Bookstore, and Ron is here with AJC book editor Suzanne Van Atten to discuss In the Valley. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello from the AJC Decatur Book Festival. I'm Suzanne Van Atten and I'm here with Ron Rash. Hi, Ron. It's nice to talk to you again.
Good to be here.
Good. Where are you speaking from today?
Well, today I'm actually speaking from Clemson, South Carolina, but I was in Cullowhee teaching Monday, so I tend to go back and forth.
Okay.
I wish I were in the mountains today. Yeah, it's a little cooler.
You're teaching in the classroom?
Yes, we are. We still are. And I really, even though it's risky, I mean, we're very careful, but teaching in person is so different. I really much prefer it if possible.
Yeah, I bet so. I bet so. So just in case there's anybody out there who isn't familiar with your illustrious career, let me just give a quick rundown. And please correct me if I get anything wrong. You've written 7 critically acclaimed novels, 6 collections of short stories, 4 collections of poetry, plus a children's book. You've won a number of awards, including the O. Henry Prize, and you've been a finalist at least twice for the PEN Faulkner Award. 2 of your novels have been made into movies, most notably Serena, the New York Times bestseller that you're probably best known for. You're professor of Appalachian Cultural Studies at Western Carolina University, and you're a husband and a father.
Yes, I am.
So my first question is, when do you sleep?
Well, when my children were young, that was pretty much something I didn't do much of. But I made a decision pretty early on that I would not have a social life. So that, once I cut that out and quit going to parties and movies and things like that, that actually opened up a little more time. But yeah, it's I think it's just a matter of certain priorities.
Mm. Before we get started, I wanted to congratulate you because I understand Mercer University has awarded you the Thomas Robinson Prize for Southern Literature, formerly known as the Sidney Lanier Prize. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. That award means a lot to me, and primarily because several of the writers that have been hugely important to me, Wendell Berry, Ernest Gaines, Fred Chappell, that really makes it all the better that Mercer found me, to let me be in part of that, join that team, I guess, or at least get my letter jacket.
Nice. And so that's awarded in a couple of days, right? Is that going to be an in-person thing?
It will not be in person, but it will be on video. I think it's at 1:00 on Saturday. So,
okay.
Yeah, I wish it were in person, but this is the best we can do, I'm afraid.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And also, before we go further, I need to mention to our viewers that down below the screen is a button to ask questions. We'll get to questions towards the end of this conversation. And also there's a donate button for the AJC Decatur Book Festival. So I encourage everybody to show their support for the festival by making a donation.
I would second that. Festival's been very good to me. I think I was there, I think the first one, and
Oh yeah?
it's been, yeah, it's a great festival, and the people have worked very hard, and it's a good cause.
Yeah, it really is. Didn't you say earlier that some of your biggest audiences have been at
Yeah, I've always had really good turnouts there, and really good support, and that's always good for a writer to be able to get that.
So congratulations are also in order for your new book, which I'll hold up, but I guess it'll be reversed. But what a gorgeous cover.
Yeah, I love that cover. It's probably my favorite of any cover I've ever gotten for a book. So yeah, it's exquisite.
Did you have any say?
Well, I did. They did run it by me, and the second I saw it, I said, "That's it."
That's great.
We had a couple of other covers, but that was the one I knew it just fit the book.
Yeah, it really does. Well, it's a fantastic book. I loved it very much. And just to be clear, the book is called In the Valley,
right?
And it contains a novella called In the Valley, as well as 9 short stories. I'd like to talk about the novella first.
Sure.
It's such a thrilling return to the world of Serena. But before we talk about that, for those who may not be familiar, can you briefly talk about what Serena is about?
Well, Serena was written in 2008 or published in 2008. It was about the fight for the Smoky Mountains National Park in the late 1920s, early 30s. And it's an amazing story. I mean, the history is, riveted because there were very strong interests against the park, financial interest in the United States. But there was also this support actually from everyone from, Nelson Rockefeller down to children saving pennies at the mountain schools. So it was a story about that. And also it was a story I felt was important to tell because of certain threats to environment during that time, particularly to the parks and wilderness areas. And so that book dealt with that. And one reason I felt compelled to go back to do a sequel, or at least the novella, was that I think some of these same issues are really, really important and relevant right now as far as the loss of wilderness and parks.
Mm-hmm. I think it's, worth mentioning that In the Valley as a novella stands alone independently from Serena, even though it does go back to that same setting and a lot of the same characters. It is a piece that stands on its own. Although I think anybody who reads it, who hasn't read Serena, will want to go back and read Serena. I'm wondering if you could start by reading a selection from the novella.
Yeah, I thought I'd start. This is the opening. And when I thought about Serena coming back from the United States, she thought, well, what would be a kind of entrance that she should make? And I thought, well, what if I have her descending out of the heavens, almost like a goddess, or actually a kind of a Wagnerian, Valkyrian coming out? And I thought that'd be a great way to have her return to the United States, and also to kind of introduce her back into the story, and for the reader who has not read Serena. So this is how it starts, and some of the listeners may recognize the intrepid young female reporter at the end who dares to ask Serena a question. When Serena Pemberton stepped out of the Commodore seaplane in July of 1931, a small but fervent contingent of reporters and photographers awaited her. Except for the pilot, she was alone. Those who would accompany her to the logging camp, both beast and human, had arrived by ship the night before. They were already on the train that would take them from Miami to North Carolina, all except for her minion Galloway, who procured an automobile to drive Serena to the station. As the metal ramp was readied, Galloway positioned himself beside the bottom step. He was short and wiry, shabbily dressed, a purple stump protruding from one sleeve. As cameras flashed mere inches from his face, he did not blink. As Serena descended, the first question shouted at her addressed the rumors surrounding her husband's death. For a moment, it didn't appear she would answer. But when her booted feet settled securely on the ground, the question was asked again, but with a caveat. Had she loved her husband? I loved my husband, but one always learns from disappointments. But what of his death, Mrs. Pemberton? And what of so many others of your acquaintance, the reporter asked. Logging is a dangerous business, she answered. Galloway was in front of her now, but Serena, almost a head taller, was clearly visible. He cleared the path as more questions came. Would she continue to fight against the national park? And would she address the rumor that she was connected to the recent demise of Horace Kephart, the park's chief advocate? Did she oppose the Davis-Bacon Act? Why risk a transatlantic enterprise when she and her husband had achieved so much in the United States? Galloway opened the DeSoto's passenger door. Serena was about to get in when the sole woman in the group, a reporter for the New Republic, stepped close. She was very young, but like Serena, tall and blonde. When will you have achieved all your ambitions, Mrs. Pemberton? She asked, as others jostled around them. When the world and my will are one, Serena answered.
Thank you. Thank you
The
very much.
woman is Martha Gellhorn, who was an intrepid World War II reporter. She was on the, she was in the combat areas and actually was married to Hemingway, but a formidable woman. She also wrote novels, but she's probably better known as a journalist. So I thought she would be the kind of woman that would dare to, maybe you can see Serena as a role model.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, Serena is such a rich, memorable character. I know that, readers are thrilled to return to her world in the Valley. But what made you as a writer want to go back to that place and time?
Well, I really didn't want to. I've written a sequel, and I've never, and I never will. I don't know. That's not what I want to do. But I did. The characters, particularly a character named Ross, just kept telling me, that his story was important. And I thought, well, and as I said earlier, the environmental issues are so prevalent and relevant right now that I felt, well, I've got to go back, but I can't do it as a novel. Short story would just be too short. So I've always admired novellists, writers who can do that. That's a tough form. And I'd never written one. So I thought this would be an opportunity where I could do that. And it is a very difficult form. I learned that pretty quickly. And so, but I felt like that was the right form for this book. And it allowed me enough space to where I felt like I could really write a complete narrative and one that didn't feel just, merely an appendage to the novel.
Right. So what sort of challenges did returning to that world present, especially considering the fact that the novel Serena contains an epilogue that jumps ahead in time and tells the reader what became of her? And, so how do you go back and re-enter that story?
Well, that was part of the challenge, and also, you know, giving some background, but not enough to really slow down a reader who doesn't want to read the novel. And so that was a real balancing act. But there were questions in Serena that were unanswered. I think the one that disallowed me, one question was how Rachel Harmon really knew she was safe. Because in the novel, you know, we see her in Seattle, but we don't know much about, you know, what is her future there. We get some implications perhaps, but it gave me a chance to show her strength and courage.
And for those who might need a reminder or hadn't read Serena, Rachel Harmon is the woman who bears Serena's husband's illegitimate child, correct?
Yes. And Serena, one reason that she comes back to North Carolina to finish her timber empire, to complete all of the logging, but she also, there's a prophecy that if the child, Rachel Harmon and her child survive, that they will be a threat to Serena and to her henchman Galloway. So part of the quest for them is to finally find Rachel and her child. So this explains how that is attempted, and also how Ross intervenes and you know, to try to stop it.
Ross being
a
logger. Loggers.
Yeah, and a minor character in Serena, but a character that I always felt like had a lot of depth to him. I knew he was the smartest and the most educated of the loggers, but and actually this kind of bled into what's happening with COVID, because the last few months I was working on the novella, the COVID nightmare force began, and Ross's family, his children and his wife are killed by the 1918 flu epidemic. So I saw some ways harrowing parallels, but also how does a human being who's lost so much find something to go on and find some cause? And that cause in the novel is at least protecting this young woman who would have been his own daughter's age.
Rachel Harmon, right, correct. Yeah. You know, one of the most harrowing images, I think, in the Valley is this this logging operation that is literally removing every single tree in this vast valley. And it's just kind of horrifying watching this kind of rape of the land. But one of the things I think you do so beautifully is between chapters, you weave these parts of what I guess is sort of a prose poem that is about the creatures fleeing the forest as the last of the trees are wiped out. It's just so moving. I was hoping maybe they're just little interstitial pieces. I was wondering if you might read one of those.
I would, and to me that was, you know, as I said earlier, I really needed this book to feel structurally, but also complete in a number of ways. And finally, it was actually pretty late in the writing, I realized that if I could see this valley as a kind of Noah's Ark, except on a level where it's not so much the animals are coming into the ark to be saved, they're leaving it. And that's when I felt like, okay, I've got a novella that is complete. And that was when I finally felt like, okay, this is something I can feel good about publishing. Mm. And so I'm glad you pointed that out, because it was crucial. And just that image of, I thought the animals leaving, you know, and just kind of going down the chain from the higher mammals to the fish and the amphibians and reptiles. But one section, the animal will be the birds, and they start leaving as the forest is decimated and the workers. And this is the little, as you say, kind of a prose poem. The broad-winged hawk left, many in pairs, others singly, then the Carolina parakeet and yellow-billed cuckoo, barred owl, indigo bunting, and then the cedar waxwing and wild turkey, wood thrush and scarlet tanager, ruffed grouse, northern cardinal, and after that, the yellow warbler and goldfinch, barn swallow and rose-breasted grosbeak, red-winged blackbird and eastern bluebird, raven and mourning dove. The dove leaving last would once again kind of fit that biblical analogy.
Right, right. That's so, it really speaks to our current time too, you know. I mean, there's this, since COVID, people seem to really be embracing the outdoors, and birding has suddenly become of interest. So there's just a timeliness to this that you obviously didn't foresee.
No, but it's there, and it's really interesting. I've really noticed the return of wildlife when I've been outdoors. It seems that, I don't know if it was less traffic, maybe fewer fatalities or whatever, but the animals just seem to be, and it's wonderful. I mean,
Yeah.
it really seems to be a real, you know, they just seem to be out more.
Yeah. Well, I know that the protection of wilderness areas is a big concern for you, and was an inspiration for Serena and in the Valley. What do you think is our biggest threat to national parks right now?
Oh, I think it's right now, unfortunately, I think it's that, there may be some, regulations that are relaxed or done or are being done away with, particularly one that's gotten the most attention recently is what's happened with the salmon fisheries in Alaska. But one reason I wanted to write the book, this novella, with Serena, is just to remind people how hard won these areas are, and how easily lost. I mean, Serena pretty much decimates this whole valley in just less than a year.
So about the short stories in the Valley, is there a common thread that connects them?
I hope so. I always, when I write a collection, I really work hard at making it, I think the way a musician works with a CD, that you want the sum to be greater than the individual parts. So I probably had 18 short stories. So I cut them down halfway. I wanted 9 that worked together. And what was happening, particularly with COVID, as I was finishing up, had an influence, I think, on the stories I included, the ones I didn't. But I wanted several things to happen. I wanted the reader to start off in the mid-1800s, and then I hope the stories establish a kind of weave through time, and maybe even a little bit of an unmooring for the reader, so that the reader sometimes has a sense of not quite sure, am I in the present day? Am I, 100 years ago? And so I think I hope, I tried to create a rhythm that way. I also found myself, and I think this is because of what was happening with COVID, that I really wanted to emphasize stories that showed people in really tough situations, but doing the best that they could, not always maybe making the right decision, but for the most part, rising to the occasion. A quote I love is by William Faulkner. He said he thought most people were a little bit better than their circumstances ought to allow. And I believe that. And I think sometimes that what we do realize, even in a time as stressful and tough as this one, is that we see people in our own families, friends, maybe some disappoint us, but I think most of the time we see that they are trying to do the right thing. They are showing resiliency and courage. And so I would say maybe the dominant theme of the stories, for the most part, would be that sense of people kind of trying to rise to tough occasions. I mean, very tough ones. For instance, the young woman in the first story, of course, but then you see in a story such as The Last Bridge Burned, a man that tough and cynical who has this moment where he, I think, even surprises himself with a moment of decency. And I think those are stories that are important, and they're important because they're true. And the novel actually, the whole book begins with a quote about these matters. And I may just read it, and it's by Bonhoeffer, who during World War II, a Lutheran minister, was heroic fighting the Nazis and ultimately gave up his life. But I really, as you know, one of the last things I did was I was trying to find some words that would kind of introduce these stories. And I couldn't find any better because Bonhoeffer's always been one of my heroes. And what he said in this letter was, and I do not mean the faith which flees the world, but the one that endures the world and that loves and remains true to the world in spite of all the suffering which it contains for us. That to me is a hard won view of hope, and it's not sentimental at all, but it's those words have stayed with me, and I felt like that was kind of the tone I really hoped this work would maybe resonate with.
Right. Well, the first story in the book is Neighbors, which is set Civil War era. Can you talk about that story, what it's about, and why you decided to start the book with it?
Well, I felt like that was the story to start with because I felt like, even though it's set in the 1800s during the Civil War, it's the most relevant because it's about the cost of tribalism and what can happen. I hope it reads as a warning because in the story we see this horrible situation where a young woman with two children is torn between what the society wants from her, one side of the society and the other, and it puts her in a place of great harm, but also I think a place of tragedy because she has to lose so much in either decision she makes. So I hope that was a cautionary tale and one very relevant to what's happening today or what can happen. And unfortunately, what has happened around the world all too often, whether it's Rwanda or Kosovo, and we don't want it to happen here. And that the impulse of the story is hoping that it will be a kind of warning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing that struck me about that story was how it was such an illustration of that brother versus brother conflict. And it just really drove home what that means to be at odds to that degree with your neighbor. So it's a very powerful story. And one of my favorite stories is L'Homme Blissey, which I had to look up because I don't know French. It means wounded man in French. And I'm curious, can you tell us about that story and what it means? I thought it was particularly also appropriate to the pandemic as well.
Yeah, well, it's probably my favorite story in the collection. If I pick one. I'm sure Madame Hedden, who failed me in French 1 at Crest High School in North Carolina, I don't know if she would be appalled that I actually named a story in French. I had the lowest average ever recorded at Crest High. I don't know if I've still got the record. It was like 3 for half a year. But I've always been fascinated with those cave paintings in France. They go back, some of the earliest ones are 35,000 years old. And even as a child, I can remember really just being haunted by them. There's something there. It's almost genetic, I think. way we respond to that. And I've just always been fascinated because that's that moment where, as human beings, we first, those were among the first moments where we see humans, or what, become the need for art, that the need to express ourselves. And I've always been drawn to that, but also the sophistication. But I wanted to write a story about trauma. And you're right. I mean, I think it fits exactly kind of in the world we're in now. And where do we find solace? How do we find strength? And for this particular soldier, I think he finds it in an interesting way, because in a way the story is a kind of mystery. How does this World War II veteran in the North Carolina mountains suddenly begin to create representations of cave art in France? And I thought that would be an interesting premise, but also I think the story really didn't click until I understood what was happening to the art teacher, his backstory. I think that's when the connections became more clear. And I hope that makes the story expand into something, bigger than just these two individuals.
Mm-hmm. And your father was an art professor, right?
He was, yeah. He had, actually, I grew up and he had a little representation of that, or photograph of some of the artwork. And he taught high school, and then he ultimately ended up teaching in college, which wasn't bad for a boy. Grew up in the Mill Village and dropped out of high school, got a GED, and then went back and decided he wanted to be a teacher and make art. So he set the bar high for me.
That's amazing. So speaking of the pandemic, I trust your family is safe and healthy.
We are. I've got a grandson now. Actually, I dedicate the book to him, Colin Rash, and that I think had an impact on the last story, where I have a grandfather saving his grandson's life. And so we're fine now. I mean, everybody's healthy, but it's a scary time for us all, I think. But in a way, it makes you treasure the moments with your loved ones more.
Yeah.
We can't take it for granted as much.
Yeah, that's for sure. Have you read anything during the pandemic you would recommend?
Oh, I've been reading a lot. I actually read a book of cave art, but yeah, I've read several things. The most exciting thing for me personally is George Singleton, who's been, we've been friends since I think I was 20 and he was 16. He has his collected stories now, and I don't know. George has a good. People know him. He's a great writer, great guy. But his book is coming out, and I've read the stories almost.
I'm reading it right now.
Yeah, and he does that. He's just wonderful. I mean, nobody can write like him. There's humor there, but he's one of those writers that people call him a comic writer, but he's like all the good writers. He transcends any single label. David Joy has a really fine book out. I finished it today. When These Mountains Burn. Same kind of thing. It's one of those books. Somebody asked me recently, am I a Southern writer? And I said, well, yeah, I'm a Southern writer. I'm an Appalachian writer. I'm a noir writer at times, but I'm also, I'm always a little leery of the word that somebody wants to put the word just. But, David is a literary writer. He really is. He's first rate. And this new book, is really well done. And Annette Clapsaddle, and I think you're reading that now, if I'm not mistaken. She has a new book out, Even As We Breathe. And once again, it does the same thing. I mean, she writes about the Cherokee culture, but Once again, the book transcends. It is that, but it's also so much more. I mean, it's a book that I found, particularly the ending, magnificent. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've actually been reading more than I would normally read, but that's great. And I'm the one person I am reading now that I've gone back to that I didn't mention, more not recent writer, is Chekhov. Okay. Short story writer, and I've just been blown away. I'd read him, since I was probably 20, but maybe it's that I hadn't lived long enough to know how good he is. But I tell you, he is. He's the greatest short story writer. I mean, I wish I could read Russian, but even in translation, the power and the complexity of those stories come through.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned labels earlier. I know sometimes your writing is lumped in with that label of Appalachian noir or hillbilly noir, a genre that's really gained in popularity. Yeah. There are so many writers coming out of the mountains now. But I wondered, what you thought about that distinction, if you think it's a fair label.
Well, I think it's fair in the sense that, Daniel Woodrell, who wrote Winter's Bones, one of my friends, and, he had a phrase, country noir. And I think that is valid. I mean, I think there is a kind of noir sensibility. Some people actually, though, called it Gothic. It's kind of interesting. Gothic and noir, to me, kind of bleed together. I mean, when we talk about Faulkner or O'Connor, so I'm not so sure that's radically different, though I know it's about crime, but certainly, my first novel, One Foot in Eden, is a noir novel. I mean, it is, but it is, I hope it's much more than that. I think it is, but I'm fine with the labels. I mean, I think I'm certainly part of that. The region I am an Appalachian writer, very proud of that. I'm proud of the Southern tradition I'm in. I like the idea that, a novel such as One Foot in Eden and more recently The Risen, I think you can use that. But as I say, the only thing I don't like is to be boxed. And I don't think that's where I have the problem. Somebody asked me that, as I said, about being a Southern writer. And I thought, well, if you're putting a just in front of that, I will, not bristle, but I'll find that a little bit constraining, because I've found, for instance, how often do you hear somebody say, well, she's a Manhattan writer? I think, the implication sometimes is that, you're just this
less than, or yeah.
Yeah. And I would argue the most provincial writers, some of the most provincial writers I've read are writers in New York City.
Right.
They're writing about upper middle class people, and to me, but then at the same time, a writer such as Richard Price, I think, is a great writer. And once again, sometimes people call him a crime writer, and he is in some ways, but he transcends that label to me. I think he writes better about New York than anyone.
Interesting. Yeah. So I guess one last question before we get to questions from our viewers. Can you tell us what your writing process is like? Do you write every day?
Yeah, I'm very Protestant. I grew up Southern Baptist. That's why I'm actually having a glass of wine now, but I had to wait till the sun goes down, to see me. Yeah, and different writers, it works different ways for different writers, but I think part of this, and actually George Singleton and I share this, we both were runners in high school, and I actually continued to run in college, but we both kind of felt like the training we did as athletes, particularly runners, because distance runners, middle distance, tend to, work out alone. It's not a team sport in a lot of ways. So I think that kind of discipline made me created kind of writer I am. So I go in every day. I write. I try to get in 4 to 6 hours a day. When I was younger, I did even more than that when I could. When I had younger children, I couldn't do as much. But I think I find ways to get it done. And I think the easiest thing in the world, I tell my students this, is that to find an excuse not to. And it's the days that where I'd rather stick, as I tell people, stick pencils in my eyes than write another line. I mean, I think those are the days that make someone a writer. I mean, I think, you having a journalist background, I think that kind of discipline is important. And I've never really had a problem with writer's block. And I think part of it's because I don't wait for inspiration. I view it more very often as a grind, or not even a grind, but just part of the rhythm of my day.
Right. Right. Yeah. I've always said that I never had the luxury of a writer's block.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's, I think that's the way to look at it. And if you don't write every day, it becomes unnatural. The same as working out or, every other aspect of your day.
Right. Right.
I am very ritualistic, though. I will say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have certain things done at a certain time, and
like what? Like,
I've got to do certain things. I sharpen a couple of pencils. I have a 48 ounces of tea, and one of the saddest things that I feel I've betrayed my culture is that now it's unsweet instead of sweet. But so I'll get that, and I'll put that here, and I'll sip on it. And but I tend to have everything where it should be, and that once again is I think, but that's once again that's part of making it by doing the same thing every day. It once again it's kind of part of that repetition that you're kind of entering the space.
Right. Right. Are you writing on a computer or longhand?
I tend to write longhand first.
Okay.
And then I'll, very often I'll put it, maybe write a paragraph or at least most of it, and then I'll put it on the machine. But whenever I do a lot of drafts, I always run it off and get a hard copy after, first time I type it in, and then I mark it up with a pencil because I think sometimes it looks too good on a computer screen. So I like to make it, actually I can show you, it's not where I work, but I think you can see, I don't know if you can see the page, but, it ain't there yet. And that's good, that to me is the fun part when I do drafts. First, the early parts are the part I drew with a story or something.
Right. It's like creating that clay, right? That you get
absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the metaphor I use. All I want, on the wheel, is just a big, ugly glob of something to work with. And, that's the way it works, man. I mean, some writers can just start out and pretty well and have a pretty good idea, carry it in their heads. We all do it differently, but for me, I found that I just don't expect it to be very good at first. And that keeps you from kind of getting paralyzed by expecting it to have every line, maybe have every sentence make sense and fit right in early on.
Right, right. Well, I better get to some of these questions. So question 1, Serena reminds me of Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones. Flying assistant, blonde, and scorched earth policy. Does this resonate with your intent?
Well, unfortunately, I've never read or seen Game of Thrones, so I apologize. I would say, however, that I did have a number of character or historical characters in mind. I mean, and a lot of people bring up Lady Macbeth, but I think Serena's she is in part, certainly some parallels there and conscious parallels, but I think she's much stronger than Lady Macbeth. she doesn't crack. She's tougher. But I had Marlowe's Tamerlane, Queen Elizabeth, and I never can pronounce her name, but the Egyptian was I always say it wrong. It's Netha. I never can say her name right, but she was a Egyptian ruler, and she actually was always, they had a beard on her, and I can never, it starts with an N.
I can't
I'm
help
sure
it.
some, yeah. So, and also a little bit of a Wagnerian, the Valkyrians, but I, you know, she really ultimately, I hope she was just a distinctive character on her own, that she wasn't so much modeled any character. I just found her kind of fascinating when she came to me, and I just kind of, after that, I ran with her. But there is a great moment, I think, when Queen Elizabeth and Tamerlane did this too, where they actually, both of them stepped onto a map of the world, you know, where you know, wherever they were building, you know, some room. And I just thought that, you know, Serena actually does that in novel, Serena.
Right.
And I just thought, wow, you know, what ambition,
Yeah.
what confidence. And so I did a lot of, you know, kind of background, Medea. Yeah, you know, all the, you know, I really wanted her to feel like a character kind of out of that older mythological world. But a lot of it was just kind of, you know, winging it and just trying to make her into a character that was maybe different from other characters, that particularly women at that time. I thought that would be interesting to show a woman who was so formidable.
Right.
I hope, yeah.
She sure is.
Well, thank you.
Oh, here's one about your short story, Ransom. Still gives me a chill when I think about it. Would you mind sharing a bit about how the characters were developed?
Yeah, that story was one that actually, that and Flight were the last two stories I did. And one reason I wanted to write Ransom is just, you know, how devastating the opioid epidemic has been, and particularly in Appalachia and Ohio and, you know, rural areas. And so I wanted to write a story about that, but I just didn't want it to be a diatribe. And to me, that was where I hope the reader, as the reader was reading it, one, I tried to be subtle as far as what she was taking at first. You know, that some people might think it was a Bayer aspirin or something, you know, because I don't really overtly say what it is that she's being fed by her captor. But I hope that the story humanized both her and the man who has kidnapped her and now is essentially turning her into a drug addict. And that's a horrific situation. But I hope that, it's a harrowing story. But I think the reader maybe understands it, but it's tragic at the same time. But to me, that whole story rests on the last line.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think if the story works, I think that last line has to do a lot of heavy lifting, and I hope it did.
I feel like a lot of your stories, that last line just hits you like a punch in the gut, you know?
Well, I spend a lot of time on those lines. And you know, I mean, I think short stories have such they have real challenges, and I think the challenge is that, and I've said this before, but I think a really good short story, you know, a story by Carson McCullers or O'Connor, Welty, Faulkner, Hemingway, you know, I think that the stories I love most have the intensity and concision of poetry in many ways, but they also have a satisfying narrative, and you know, that you might get out of a novel. I mean, it's on a much lesser scale, and it's a different kind of narrative satisfaction. But the stories that are great, even though sometimes it almost seems as if it's a glimpse into a character's life. I think we leave that knowing that that moment has told us something crucial about the character, about the situation, and that we don't feel like we really need any more. That to me is the power of the best short stories. They can do both those things. It's a real tightrope, and they're not easy, but when they work, as with Chekhov, as I say, I've been reading Chekhov so much the last couple of weeks that when they happen, I mean, there's something that goes there that happens that doesn't happen in a novel. It doesn't happen anywhere. That can't happen in a movie, or it's just this thing that it's almost like, I would say it's like throwing, I've never said this before, but it strikes me this way. It's like throwing a rock into a pond, and it just starts rippling out and out and out. And very often it is the ending that does that for us.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that leads to another question someone had is, what makes the novella, you said, a tough form?
It's an in-between form. Well, no, I wouldn't say that doesn't do it justice. What I found was that it really, I think, even more so, the short story, I think Alice Munro once said, it was almost like walking through a room, and a novel is living in a house. That's a really good, I think, way of looking at that. But what I found with the novella is that there's more of a need to tell essentially more like a life, I guess you would say, in many ways. It's not just a glimpse. I mean, you're really having to go into a place, a situation deeply, and maybe it's not so much that it's just about just a few characters, but you're also having to create a world in a way that you don't with a short story necessarily. I mean, you do in a way, but not as much. And the length, it's just kind of in there, but there's a kind of balance, and it either works or it doesn't. Dennis Johnson's Train Dreams is probably the best one I've read in the last, that's published in the last quarter century. That to me is the one that stunned me. But it's just it's a different level, and I found it very difficult. And I think partly because you've got to, in a sense, also explain so much in a way you don't with the short story, yet you don't have the luxury of the time that you would have in a novel. And you just can't, once again, it's kind of like a short story that you can't make a lot of wrong turns. I mean, you can't dawdle. You have to get down to it and move.
Yeah, there is like an economy to it, isn't there?
Yeah.
Within the Valley, did you write it longer and have to cut it back, or did you write it to length? Or
I wrote it all sorts of ways. I mean, I probably wrote more drafts of that than any novel. Yeah, I know I did. I mean, I worked on it in probably 4 years.
Wow.
I just kept taking wrong turns, wrong characters, wrong everything. And there was also the problem because I did want to evoke Serena, that I didn't want the reader to feel like, well, I've got to read Serena again. So I had to bring in a good bit of backstory, but do it in a way that didn't bog down the story, the novella itself. And that was a real challenge. And I hope I did it. I mean, I really worked hard at it, but I mean, I spent more time on that. I spent as much time on that as I would a novel.
Wow. Wow. Well, it shows.
I hope so, because every word I felt like I was, drawing blood to get it right.
Well, here's our last question because we're about out of time. Someone wants to know, what is your favorite Chekhov story since you've been reading Chekhov lately?
Wow. You know, a lot of people talk about the lady with the pet dog, and I love that story. And the story Misery, which is about the man who's lost his son. But there are two stories that have just really knocked me out recently rereading them. One is the Huntsman, which has the most powerful ending. What it does at the end with the last image is just incredible. I won't give it away. But the other one is the one that's it translates in different words, but it's one way I read is The Student. It's about a young man who is studying divinity, and he's home. This is Russia. He's having to walk back to his home in cold weather, and he doesn't get all the way there, but he has to stop because it's cold and he's hungry. It's a dark night. It's actually Easter time or, Good Friday. And there's a woman there and her daughter by the fire. They're poor people. And they give him what little they have. And there's a fire going. And he starts to tell them the story of Peter denying Jesus. And they're transfixed, and he watches the woman's eyes, this woman who's incredible hardship of her life. And she's streaming these tears because because of what happens with Peter. And he describes, Peter knowing how he betrayed Christ. And he's kind of been really, in a sense, really down, feeling, just almost despair. And it's suddenly as if he understands that the fact that this story can move her, it echoes back into time, all the way back to Peter. But it's not just the religious idea there. It's the idea of story. Mm-hmm. A story that had begun, whether you believe the metaphysical story or not, that it can continue through time and still move us to that kind of moment. And he leaves, and that is the story. And it's only 10 pages probably.
Yeah.
That is my favorite. So I hope that's a good answer.
That's a great answer. Well, Ron, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful, great questions, and I appreciate your support, and I appreciate the support of the festival. I hope I'll be there in person, and maybe we can do this on the stage and talk same way.
I sure hope so. Folks, please donate to the AJC Decatur Festival. Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.